So E3 has been and gone this year, and everyone has gone through their typical E3 routines. Kojima confused people, EA still don't understand how humans work, and Naughty Dog showed a nice heavily scripted section of their upcoming gaming Oscar bait, Mopey Ladder Simulator Part 2. When I checked Twitter, I noticed that people were going through another annual routine, getting angry at Jonathan McIntosh for saying the exact same thing he says every year. Why are these games so violent? If you don't know who Big Johnny McIntosh is, he's the guy who produced Anita Sarkeesian's video game critiques. Regardless, if we can pack that resentment in for a minute, I had a look at what he was actually saying and I have to admit, he's got a point. Of course, that point isn't going to get much credit when it's dripping with resentment and sizzling contempt for the gaming community, although I don't really blame him. So I thought I might give my own thoughts on the issue of violence in video games and how it might be just a wee bit oversaturated. Now before we go any further, I would like to make it absolutely clear that I don't think there's anything wrong with violence in media. Hell, some of my favourite games can only be charitably described as total gore fests. If you're of stable mind, violent media won't do you any harm, and the only violence it desensitises you to is fake violence. I can play hours of Killing Floor and Doom without feeling the slightest bit ill, but show me one broken bone in real life and you'll have to bring a boke bucket. I'm also dead against the censorship of violent media. So now that we have that clarification out of the way, I'd like to propose that maybe, just maybe, games can do more than just violence. Think about it, when was the last time you played a game that didn't feature any violence whatsoever? For me, I guess I could say Portal, but even then there is some robot abuse. It's kind of inescapable. Now the issue here isn't with your Dooms, or your Killing Floors, or your God of Wars. The games I mentioned there do violence really well. They revel in it and it just works. The issue is that violence gets crowbarred into every game. There always has to be a combat system. Take Mirror's Edge as an example. That game was about free running and running away from stuff, which made it unique and fun. You know what everyone criticised? The combat, and rightly so. So my question is, would the game really lose anything if you had no offensive options? I would argue it would gain something. It would gain an element of tension and fear from the fact that you're defenceless and have to run. Still, we should examine if video games actually are particularly violent when compared to other media. We're not in the 1970s anymore. Not even the oldest Daily Mail reading idiot is actually concerned about quote-unquote violent music anymore. It's just not a thing that people complain about these days. But what about films and TV shows? There's no shortage of violence there. Horror films and even a lot of new action films are pretty gory. And let's not forget Game of Thrones, The Walking Dead, or any of Marvel's Netflix series. The thing is, when these movies and shows are violent, they're seen as being particularly violent. Whereas in gaming, this level of gore is commonplace. In addition, there is no gaming equivalent to a sitcom or romance or any kind of drama that's resolved with verbal arguments, apart from maybe Phoenix Wright. Sure, a lot of games have terrible romances written by people who have never been in a relationship but have witnessed a few through binoculars. There are diplomatic options in some games, and there are frequent attempts at comedy. So perhaps equivalence might be possible in future, but it'll be a while before we see anything prominent. Maybe there really is an untapped goldmine of interesting game ideas waiting to be developed once the industry abandons the need for violence and everything. Now, I'm certainly not the first person to bring these points up. As well as Jonathan McIntosh, Jim Sterling has pointed this stuff out. But what neither of them did was examine why violence is more ubiquitous than Nolan North in the first place. Can we please admit that there are reasons why violence is so common?
Can you at least admit that every ass kicking doesn't just fall out of the fucking sky?
There are numerous factors which should be understood. In fact, there are so many it gets a bit ridiculous the more you look into it. The oversaturation of violence in gaming isn't a happy accident. A combination of legitimate reasons and the specific circumstances and culture surrounding the games industry is what established violence as the status quo. So, let's explore why video games are so violent.
Raining blood from a lacerated sky, bleeding its horror, creating my structure. Now I shall rain in blood.
To understand the games industry's violent tendencies, you have to go back to the very early days of gaming. Pong wasn't technically the first ever video game, but it's the first recognisable example. No matter how much influence you claim Led Zeppelin had in creating metal, they're still not a metal band. We draw the line at Black Sabbath as being the first metal band, and for the purpose of this video, I'm drawing the line at Pong as being the first video game. Pong is, unsurprisingly, a very simple game. It's effectively the most abstract possible form of tennis. Two rectangles bounce a square between one another, and if one of them misses it, a point is awarded to the other. When video games were a brand new concept, this was people's introduction. A new type of game that was much less physically demanding than a sport and far less static than a board game. But in such a basic form, we can see that it is, at its core, just a game. A game has to have winners and losers. This is why many people struggle to see video games as an art form, because they still have the idea of the earliest days of video games where there was no story or emotion. They still have this image of such a simplistic thing. They tend to be quite ignorant about the decades of development and innovation that radically evolved it into the art form we know today. Fucking pricks. As games evolved, they immediately started adding a context to things. Once they could create more than just abstract shapes, the graphics began to represent something. Maybe there was an alien invasion, or maybe there were ghosts, but the games were still very basic. There needed to be a challenge, and in turn there needed to be a fail state. A simple and very quick way to lose. And the most obvious way of achieving this was by having an instant death to be the fail state. In Space Invaders, you shoot the aliens and blow them up, and if the aliens land, your wee tank explodes. This innocent arcade game just confronted you with your own mortality. Same goes for Pac-Man. The fail state is being killed by ghosts. They chase you, which creates an exciting game as you have to escape them. And if you eat the right pellet thing, in Soviet Russia, Pac-Man chase you! And when Pac-Man finally catches one of these ghosts, he swallows them whole, leaving only their eyes so they can witness their own fate. And if they catch you, Pac-Man's spine is compressed as he collapses in on himself in an agonising display of brutality. The point is, when games were this basic, they needed an instant fail state, and the one that worked was death. Even something as cute as Mario Brothers can't hide the dark reality. Look at Mario's face when he dies. Pure anguish. The challenge is what made these early games fun, and there was nothing more exciting than the simulation of a life and death situation. And in these scenarios, there would always have to be some degree of violence, even in self-defense. As graphics got more and more realistic, the life and death thing never went away, but the innocent aesthetic did. And that's when people started recognising the violence as being violence. Yet developers never strayed away from the violence, even as the stories in games began to improve, which brings us to the next point. I'm sure we've all heard the phrase Ludonarrative Dissonance before, and if so, we've almost certainly heard it from the mouth of a twat. It would certainly be a lot more transparent if a contrarian games journalist said the main problem with Bioshock Infinite was the story is good, but also there is fighting. But this idea is important to consider here. The juxtaposition of gameplay and story is often a problem. Take for example any superhero game where the protagonist isn't supposed to kill people, but in the game you definitely can. The game will either grant you the freedom to kill people and can't force you to roleplay, or the game has to do something really stupid to stop you. Like in Arkham Knight Rider, also known as World of Tanks, in which you can crash a hulking metal Batmobile travelling at 50 miles per hour into a goon, and they use this stupid little electricity effect to pretend you merely stunned them. Other than these specific examples, game stories usually suit the gameplay, because more often than not they are effectively just framing devices for the action. You do get some rare exceptions, but for the most part, even the best written game stories are usually just finding narratively fulfilling excuses to blow shit up. Now, any story needs conflict. That's a very basic bit of creative writing advice. Conflict is what creates the drama, and much of the story is how the conflict is resolved. Violence is just one of many ways conflicts can be resolved, but very few of the other ways translate well into video games. Violence is the easiest kind of conflict to make interactive, and that's why so many game stories only exist as various ways of making you want to kill stuff. It's why revenge stories are so oversaturated.
My name is Blandus Whitus Genericus Characterus, father of probably a murdered wife or something. I will have my vengeance because there are literally no other plots in AAA games except for vengeance.
Plus, if you go to all the bother of making a combat system for a game, you can't just use it in one fight, because not only would it be a waste of money, but by the time the player gets used to the system, they'd never use it again. So there always has to be at least several big fights along with armies of disposable henchmen. Every now and then you might find a stealth game or a game with diplomacy options, but these are niche markets. Mainstream games go for what's easy, and what's easy is solving problems with violence. Just ask America! While we're on the subject of settings, stories and contexts, it's an undeniable fact that the games industry loves to copy the film industry. That's one of the reasons why video game movies are usually so crap, because you're effectively making a film adaptation of a knockoff of another film. The original Tomb Raider games were very much Indiana Jones inspired, and in turn, the first Tomb Raider films were just a knockoff Indiana Jones with a less sexy protagonist. Duke Nukem is a satirical caricature of 80s action stars, Deus Ex has Blade Runner written all over it, and God of War is a game built from the ground up on the idea of that cool stuff from Clash of the Titans, but angrier. Now there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, the selling points of a lot of games usually involve reminding you of a cool scene from a famous movie and saying, now you get to play that. Remember when he dodges those bullets in the Matrix? Check out Superhot and do that yourself. Remember those massive battles from Lord of the Rings? Here's a game that lets you command armies on that scale. And here's a Lord of the Rings mod for it in case the appeal wasn't obvious enough. Do you like zombie movies? Well, now you can survive a zombie apocalypse in Dead Rising. And Left 4 Dead. And DayZ. And Undead Nightmare. And The Last of Us, State of Decay, and Dying Light, and Dead Island. Now I bring this up because when the first controversial violent games appeared, dumb, violent action movies were still popular. Now they were undeniably on the decline in the early 90s, but the 80s action movies were still fresh in the memories of most game developers. And if they were going to make an action game, they were most certainly going to take some inspiration from the era of blood, squibs and explosions. Part of me does wonder what the gaming landscape would look like if the rise of the FPS had begun during the era of PG-13/12A films in the mid-2000s to the mid-2010s. But no, the game devs of the early 90s had witnessed the era of action during which when a guy got shot, blood flew out. And additionally, Doom was so influenced by Aliens that it was originally planned as a licensed game. And since Doom set the standard for shooters, the games that came after followed Doom's visceral example, and gore became the standard. Now this is all fine and good and explains why violence is so commonplace in games, but you may be wondering why the violence is so much more extreme than in films. And you'd be right, it is. Even now, with movies like Deadpool and Logan breaking the trend of PG action movies and bringing in more gore, you'll still see worse in your average Call of Duty campaign, and there is a plethora of reasons why gaming tends to be the most violent form of media. The first main reason why movies don't tend to be as violent is that if you don't want to make a gory film but there needs to be a fight scene, you can always cut away from the death, usually changing the shot to a close-up of a character reacting to what's happening. It's a cheap but effective way of neutering violence. Video games, especially first-person shooters, do not have this luxury, so when someone gets killed, you're gonna see it. Sometimes games will just have characters flop into a ragdoll when they die, but the reason they don't do this in most games is as follows: it's not satisfying. As dodgy as it sounds, there's something satisfying about gore. Your weapon will feel more powerful if you see the damage it can do. It's also an effective way of letting the player know important things. For instance, in Quake, the first time you reduce a measly grunt to giblets with a rocket launcher, you realise that you should probably save this one for the bigger guys. In addition, many people find violent games to be a good stress reliever. I know I do. If something's bugging you, fire up Brutal Doom and it should fade away fairly quickly.
Whoever you are, Sergeant Mark IV, I hope you talk to someone about all this.
I hope you don't. I hope you're alone in a room making more of these.
Was your mum divorced, married again? I'm just throwing out guesses here.
That's okay. You're
Not my real dad.
And since so many games are power fantasies, it's hard to feel powerful when your enemies flop to the floor like a damp towel. Blasting monsters to pieces is like kicking a sandcastle, it just feels good. Well, as long as it's your sandcastle. There's always a sense of fun about the violence in games, no matter how graphic it gets. Since films don't seem to get put under the same scrutiny for violence, I'll use films to illustrate my point. Let's contrast two scenes from two completely different films. The Joker's video in The Dark Knight and the church scene in Kingsman. In the former, the Joker only kills one guy and you don't even see it happen, but it's still a deeply disturbing scene.
I'm a man of my word.
Whereas in the church scene in Kingsman, Galahad kills an entire church of people in an uncut shot in which you see every gruesome death, and the scene is fun, and it's all because of the tone of these two scenes. In the Joker scene there's no music, and we're seeing crappy footage recorded on a dodgy camera with muted colours as he kills a defenceless man. In the church scene, the colours are vibrant, the action is fast, and it all happens while the guitar solo from Freebird plays in the background. In video games, apart from horror games and a few very specific examples, the violence is almost always presented the way it is in Kingsman. You don't dwell on it, and you're free in a fictional world where you don't see the consequences of the violence. Furthermore, the violence in games is exaggerated. It is cartoonishly, comically over the top, and as such it feels too disconnected from reality to be disturbing. As graphics get more and more realistic, our only two options are to show no blood at all or to make it so ridiculously violent that it ceases to resemble real life. This does, however, raise the question, why do developers never go with the non-gory approach? Well, as I said, the gore can be satisfying, but there's another possible reason. Now, this one might annoy some people, but I think it's worth saying. For a long time, the gaming community has had some very insecure tendencies, and I'm not just talking about the stockholders who didn't think they'd make enough money off a fucking Star Wars game if they didn't make it pay to win. At this point, we've come full circle, and we're going back to talking about the early days of video games. It's as if I actually structured this properly. Trust me, this was an accident. When video games first appeared, like any new form of media, they were seen as a novelty. And because early games were so simple, it was seen as a children's pastime. So, when games got more advanced, the baby boomers were shocked to see this children's toy get so violent. Many to this day still don't understand that adults play video games more so than kids. Video games came very close to being policed and censored in the 90s after Mortal Kombat came out. And ever since then, games have been getting more violent in an almost solidarity against censorship. But at times, I can't shake the feeling that the violence is being sought out as if we need to prove that gaming has grown up. Some people really feel the need to emphasise that this stuff is not for kids. Yeah, no shit, most games aren't for kids. I can't finish any quests given by a female character in The Witcher without her waving her tits in my face, because this is a mature game for smart people! You can see this insecurity whenever some old fuck nobody cares about says something stupid about games being for kids and people lose their minds. Calm down, he's a harmless idiot. The games industry makes more money than the film industry, and I don't know if you're aware of this, but if you make enough money, you can get away with a lot. You would need a 1080p video of Bobby Kotick, Hideo Kojima, and Gabe Newell raping a newborn baby before any government would even consider imposing regulation. Now let me just say, most games aren't for kids, and our favourite hobby isn't any more of a waste of time than watching TV or doing sports. What you do with your own free time is entirely up to you, and if someone tries to make you ashamed of your much needed escapism, they can fuck off. So now that we've clarified that, maybe we don't need to get so laughably serious about how deep and mature games really are. But I guess not, as we still feel the need to crowbar grisly violence into inappropriate situations, because it's not for kids, okay? I am very mature. I don't think developers are too concerned about this, but many gamers do get their jimmies in a rustle over this, and perhaps some of the demand for violence is a compensation. It's a redundant compensation because kids still play these games anyway, but that's mostly due to parents who pay no attention. I'll admit, a lot of this part is my own guesswork, but I think you see my point. You can't deny there's something that makes the gaming community deeply uncomfortable when the validity of the medium is called into question. Ultimately, there are many alternatives to violence and combat in games, but it will be a long time before these become mainstream. The reasons I have listed have made violence the status quo of the games industry, and in an industry so utterly obsessed with profits above all else, violence is here to stay for the foreseeable future. I don't think the violence is a bad thing, and I think I've shown its presence is well justified, but at the same time I wouldn't be opposed to less of it. Think about your favourite game mechanics, the things you remember about some of your favourite games. When I think about that, I think about the free running in Mirror's Edge, the portal gun, the wingsuit in Just Cause 3, the web swinging in any good Spider-Man game, the stealth in the Thief series. There's a lot of unexplored potential. But I don't think combat will overshadow it forever, because like anything in excess, we will eventually get bored of it.